I can.
So we did not script out anything whatsoever.
Nothing.
Can I say a couple remarks about your book?
Please.
Okay. So part of my job at the ACLU is to litigate cases and to talk about cases that we think exemplify the inherent flaws in the death penalty. And as part of that, we often will talk about executions that have gone awry, botched executions that have occurred throughout the country, and they're increasingly documented by concerned reporters and other reporters who happen to be there. It's actually really hard to find out about these botches, so I think there are botches happening that we don't know about. And every time we wanted to talk about one, I needed to kind of do research and, look at media articles. Sometimes there were some scholarly articles, and kind of restart that whole process and get caught up. And sometimes we knew, and there were many things we just did not know. And now we, with Corinna's book, we are caught up because the book so thoroughly documents what's happened and what's gone awry in these executions and the reasons why things have gone awry. So it was very fortuitous that in Florida several months ago, Corinna and I were both speaking on the same panel, and the book was just coming out. And I was honored to get a first copy of the book and signed before it was even available in stores. And it's just a tremendous read. And in this era we're in right now, where everything is doubted and questioned, and there's no science, there's no research, everyone thinks they have their own truth. You really need to, as Corinna says, bring the receipts, and she does. I think fully a third of the bulk of the book is those receipts, is those long footnotes. And then the first 2/3 just reads so powerfully. And I know we have some law students here. This is an example of that type of writing that you want to use, that is very direct. It's very easy to read, doesn't use a lot of fancy words. It just tells the stories, and unfortunately story after story of horrors in what our government does in executing in our name, and the stories behind those stories. So thank you, Corinna.
Well, thank you for those nice remarks. And I don't, I'm just I don't even know. I feel very, very fortunate to be a death penalty researcher, a professor with tenure, so that I can ask the questions that lead to this sort of work, and write it how I want, and write it for a general audience. And so I really do want, I think every law professor wants their work to matter in some way. We want it to make a difference. And so this warms my heart, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. And I have to say, Brian Stull was somebody who was on my list of people to reach out to as deputy director of the ACLU National Death Penalty Project. And I just hadn't gotten around to it yet. And then I found myself sitting next to him and said, wait, can we talk afterwards? And so thus began a nice friendship. But he's one of the best storytellers I've ever heard, and I told you so when I met you in Florida. So feel free. I hope this will be a conversation. I'm happy to talk, but I hope you'll sprinkle in stories of your own.
Okay. Well, we as capital defense lawyers love to tell stories, because that is what, and Steve Friedman is here, knows about storytelling. Did it for a long time here and is still involved in doing it in North Carolina. And that's what helps people to see the humanity of our clients and prevents them from going along with the state's request to execute them. But I have a question for you.
Let's go.
Okay. So one of my professors in law school was Brian Stevenson. I was very fortunate to have him at NYU Law. And one of the fundamental things he taught us was that we need to change the debate about the death penalty from does my client deserve this to does the state deserve to kill? And I think he was thinking about things not necessarily involved in this book. He was thinking about inherent racism and in the death penalty with its origins in racial violence and terror and lynching. I think he was thinking about the ongoing racism that you see in jury selection processes and in who's selected to face the death penalty, and the race of victims and the race of defendants. And I think he's thinking about the fact of the imperfection of our system, and he represented innocent people that he tells the stories about. But I don't know if he was thinking about what you're talking about. What do you think about the states? Do they deserve to kill?
Yeah. So this is a thing that I have to tell you about this book if you haven't already read it. This book is not a book where I make an argument and try to convince you that I'm right. This book is a book where I simply document relentlessly what the state is doing in our name. And I tell people in the introduction, it's not that I don't have a point of view. Of course I have a point of view. We all have a point of view. So it's not that I don't have a point of view, I do. It's just that I want readers to come to their own conclusions before they come to mine. And so my argument in the book is 2 lines long. That's it. It's the last 2 lines of the book. And I'm just going to tell you what they are. But you know what I say at the very end is, I don't trust these people. And then I drop down and say, do you? And it goes to your question. I don't make an argument, but it's really hard. I can't imagine reading this book and thinking that the state deserves to kill. And you know, that is one of the things I think when we talk about the death penalty in this country, it's always focused on that first question. Well, did they deserve it? Look what they did. They deserve it. And I always think that's half of the equation. That's only half. First of all, I'm going to disagree with people who say yes. I have things to say about that. But even setting that aside, the other side of the equation is, did the state do what it needs to do in order to deserve to take that life? And you just can't read this book and think that it can be trusted in its most powerful moment. So the answer is clear. You know, my answer is clearly no. But I think there's another piece of this that I'd love to go to, which is, you know, what Brian Stevenson's work, and he blurbed the book, which is very kind of him. But, you know, I think this question of state desert is all through, you know, I'm looking at the end game, but it's in, I mean, North Carolina is unique in that it passed a Racial Justice Act that specifically said, if you can show that race played a part in your death sentence, we're going to commute it to life without parole. And the first four prisoners proved their case so extensively. It was, I think, over a 100-page opinion, wasn't it? Maybe it was 200 pages, something like that.
I think it was 266 pages.
Yeah, I mean, like over 200 pages of relentlessly documenting race. And then I think half of Death Row, like, you know, also made the same claim. And the North Carolina legislature then repealed the act. And the lead legislator that was proposing it, I literally have my students read this, but he said, well, we have to repeal it because otherwise all of these death sentences are going to be commuted to life without parole. We're going to lose these cases. You know, and I look at that and say, you said the quiet part out loud. Race is in all of these cases. So instead of saying, oh, they can actually show the influence, the pervasive influence of race, and so maybe this isn't a good idea. Instead, we're going to rescind the act. And I think that's one of the reasons that, I don't know, maybe you disagree, but that North Carolina hasn't had executions, because not only did the legislature repeal the act, but they tried to make it retroactive so that these people that had won then are resentenced to death. And there was litigation over that, and it ends up going up to the North Carolina Supreme Court, which says, you can't do that. It's an ex post facto law, which is like maybe a thing for law students. But, you know, and so because of this litigation, we haven't seen...
That means no take-backs.
No take-backs. I love it. See, I told you he's a good storyteller. But, and so we haven't really seen executions in North Carolina, but North Carolina's, not out of the woods, and especially with the federal government, like that things can happen. So I think this is a huge part of the story. And lethal injection is something that when I think about it, I think it took a researcher to ask the question, because I don't necessarily think that the abolitionist community is gonna, critiquing how we kill, one might say, assumes there's a good way to kill and a bad way to kill. And the abolitionists are like, we don't think you should be killing at all. And so looking at how we kill is not necessarily something that I would expect them to do. And the death penalty supporters definitely do not want to know about the problems with lethal injection. So as I was going through the process of researching this book, I was thinking, why is there no book on this? This is the main execution method for the last 45 years. 98% of all executions are lethal injection. And it's completely like we're torturing people to death, all of these things. Why is there no book on it? And what I've come to think is, because I think it took someone who just wanted the research answer. And so I come at it a little differently than, someone, Brian Stevenson, but, look what we found.
Yeah, and it's a powerful indictment, and I know you don't want to make the argument. We'll come to our own conclusions, so we can unpack some of that tonight. I do want to acknowledge that there are people in the room who are very involved with bringing about enactment of the Racial Justice Act. So
rock on. Thank you.
So I guess I want to ask, there is a very well-known part, now we'll switch to medicine briefly, about the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. But in your book, you pull out, some of the lesser-known lines, at least for me. And I wanted to ask you to tell the group what that line is, and then to reflect on Jay Chapman and what he then did with that line in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And that sets the table for how we got lethal injection.
Yeah, so I actually have that tabbed. So I will, I will lay this out. For those of you who may not know, lethal injection, I'm a legal historian, so I was interested in this, but lethal injection was devised in 1977. And it was devised after a 10-year hiatus. The Supreme Court struck down the death penalty as it was then administered in 1972, brought it back in 76. By 77, the country had not seen an execution in 10 years, and legislators were really worried about people being squeamish, right? We had the electric chair. So they were looking for an alternative. They look all over. They look to the medical, both their private doctors, they're asking them, they're asking the state medical boards for help. No one wants to help. And Jay Chapman says, famously, to hell with them, let's do this. Jay Chapman is the state medical examiner. He's the coroner. And he later refers to himself as an expert in dead bodies, but not in getting them that way. And he's later interviewed he just comes up with the 3-drug protocol. He's later interviewed, how did you come up with those drugs? And he says, quote, I didn't do any research. I just knew from having been placed under anesthesia myself what was needed. I wanted to have at least 2 drugs in doses that would each kill the prisoner to make sure if one didn't kill him, the other would. Then he was asked, well, why did you add a 3rd drug? And he said, why not? I didn't do any research. You wanted to make sure the prisoner was dead at the end, so why not add a 3rd drug? Why does it matter why I chose it?
And did he write this on the back of a napkin?
I think he did, right?
I'm not sure. That's just the story I heard.
I didn't put it in the book because I wasn't sure.
You didn't have a footnote for that, so you're more honest than I am.
No, I heard that he did. But when I think of that chapter, and I have a chapter called, it's chapter 7, The Medical Profession Mandate. And I was talking to Joan Krause at UNC, a law professor. She writes in bioethics, and she was saying a lot of times the medical profession is just sort of left out of this discussion, which is weird to me because it's medicalized executions. And so I wanted to say, let's listen to what the medical profession has to say. One of the doctors, when I think of the quotes in this book, and that chapter is just filled with them, so I'm not sure which one you wanted to go to, but I think of a doctor who said, asking a doctor to help you kill is like asking a lifeguard to help you drown better. You said it's asking me to do something that my entire profession is dedicated to not happening. And this is a guy that says, look, if the state wants to kill the state, that's up to the state. Leave my profession out of it. And talks about a lot of what we talk about in that chapter is the medical profession saying we're against this. And look, they all lobbied in North Carolina too. They all lobbied the legislatures as they were passing lethal injection statutes in the 70s and early 80s. Every single place that happened, the medical profession showed up and said, do not do this. You cannot do this without us, and we are not going to help you. We're not going to give you the medical science. We're not going to advise you. We're not going to put the syringes. We're not going to be involved. You can't do it without us. Don't do this. And, as I say in the book, the lure of an execution method that looks like you're falling asleep was just too strong. They just did it anyway.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. But the part of the Hippocratic Oath I was thinking of, I thought it was just, I'll do no harm. It explicitly says.
Oh, that part.
It explicitly says, I will give no lethal drug. And then it says, I will not facilitate someone getting a lethal drug, right?
Yeah.
And so there seems to be a paradox that all started with Jay Chapman, where they decided, at the outset, we want to make this look quiet and medical and sanitary, and we want the promise of the death penalty to be, to look like a procedure that people can get on board with, to make sure that the states can continue to execute. And I don't know, have you ever heard this is an illegal term, bait and switch?
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And the line, I'll just read it because I found it. I wasn't sure which quote you wanted, but so the Hippocratic Oath, the short form is do no harm. Everyone knows that. But the long form, so what I say here is the long version of the oath is famous for just one line, the promise to, quote, never do harm to anyone. But the next line of the Hippocratic Oath reads, quote, to please no one will I prescribe a deadly drug, nor give advice which may cause its death. And so what I say then is, that's right, the idea of lethal injection, or at the time, lethal ingestion, has been strictly and explicitly forbidden for over 2,500 years by the very words of the Hippocratic Oath. It's baked into the identity of what a physician is, what it means to be, a medical professional.
And at the same time, we are to believe by these processes that we are executing people with a medical procedure, and that's part of the contract with the American people about what we're doing with the death penalty. Maybe it would be helpful for you to you mentioned the 3 drugs, so just put the 3 drugs on the table and how they've varied a little bit since then, and what their supposed purposes are.
Oh, sure. So the 3-drug protocol that Jay Chapman came up with, the first drug is changed over time, so I track that. But the first drug is supposed to be basically an anesthetic. So it's supposed to be a barbiturate. It started with sodium thiopental, but the bottom line is it's an anesthetic. And it does double duty because the second two drugs are indisputably torturous drugs. So it's an overdose, it's supposed to kill on its own, but frankly, it would take too long. So what it's really doing is being an anesthetic, supposedly, to protect against the other two drugs. So let me tell you about those, and then I'll circle back around to the first. But the second drug is really, really important to state. That is a paralytic. It's pancuronium bromide. It's a paralytic, and it's not just a paralytic, it's a muscle relaxant. And so it relaxes the muscles in the face, and then it freezes them that way. And so you're gonna get this nice drifting off to sleep, peaceful looking death, regardless of what is actually happening. And we know from the autopsies what is actually happening. Some of those veins are distended, they're going, inside. And the reason that's happening is because it paralyzes from the outside in. So it paralyzes the outside. The last thing that it paralyzes is the body's core, the muscles in the core. And that includes the diaphragm, which pumps air into the lungs. And so as the paralytic takes effect and as it moves into the diaphragm, the breathing is getting shallower and shallower as they're trying to catch their breath while the paralytic is freezing them. And so, I quote doctors saying, yeah, what's the sensation? It would be like being buried alive. It would be like being suffocated with a pillow slowly. You would be taking deeper and deeper breaths. And so that's why we see the distended veins on the inside. So that's that drug.
And by this point, the person can be killed already. So now on to the what the heck third drug.
Yeah. And so I was just going to say, just because, maybe I'll find it. But in any event, there was a doctor talking about, just how painful it is. And this doctor says, listen, the average person can only hold their breath for 1 minute. Before it becomes so torturous to hold your breath, you have to take a breath. And they say, even people who are drowning end up taking a breath. That's how you drown, but you can't hold it. The pain is so much, you cannot hold your breath that long. And so, as the diaphragm is making your breath shallower and shallower, you get this sensation called air hunger, and it is torturous. So then there's the third drug. And the third drug is a potassium chloride, and it is literally a liquid version of road salt. It's the stuff that they spray on airplanes. It's the stuff they put on the roads for icy roads. And this drug is used in very, very small amounts for all sorts of health reasons, but largely to regulate the heart. But it is called, and this is outside the lethal injection context, this is what doctors call it. They call it liquid fire because it is potassium, it's road salt, it is very caustic, and it chemically burns the veins as it races to the heart and causes a cardiac arrest. And that's how the person's supposed to die, is by this, within 2 minutes, they say, a cardiac arrest. And so here's the thing that I think, of the many things people should know. So clearly those two drugs are torturous. And one thing is that the first drug, it all comes down to that first drug, whether it's going to be torturous or not. And now states are using this drug called midazolam that is not even anesthetic. It's not even an anesthetic. And so we know prisoners are feeling the whole thing. It's just that by the time it takes effect, you've got the paralytic. And so it's really tough. But the thing I wanted to mention was that the very first Supreme Court case was actually in 2008. And one of the challenges that the prisoners made was Don't use the anesthetic. I mean, don't use the paralytic. It's not the anesthetic. It's not the thing it does no work in that regard. And it's not the thing that's supposed to be killing us. That's the third drug that's going to trigger a cardiac arrest. So why are you using this? What is the legitimate purpose? And what they said is it has no legitimate purpose. They're just using it to cover a torturous death. And shockingly, the state said, you're right. Now, they didn't use those words, but what they said was, oh yeah, there's a legitimate state purpose. The legitimate state purpose is the interest in a dignified looking death. A dignified looking death. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that works for us. And so that's why we still have states to this day using a paralytic. As I refer to, I say, look, it's like a get out of jail free card for botched executions, because as long as the paralytic takes effect and you don't have a problem with that, you're not going to see what's actually happening.
Other ACLU lawyers smarter than me, and on our free speech side of the ACLU, and I don't know if this is in any of your footnotes, litigated this in California and called it a chemical curtain, and did get a favorable decision out there in those more favorable courts. You mentioned that now the states are using midazolam, and I thought it might be a good time to talk about the maneuvers of states around pharmaceutical companies' bans on use of their drugs. And people can have some different thoughts on pharmaceutical companies because, we sometimes feel like they don't give us the medications we need or they charge too much. But there is a real feeling in those companies, despite some of those complaints we may have, that they want their medications used for healing people, not for killing people, very similar to the Hippocratic Oath. So talk about the barriers that pharmaceutical companies put up and what the state did in their cat and mouse and back alley ways to get around that.
Yeah. So this is chapter 6. It's one of my favorite chapters. It's called the Drug Supplier Saga. And it's one of my favorite chapters in part just because it's crazy town. But also there's this narrative out there. It's all abolitionists' fault. If you have bad drugs, it's because the abolitionists, put pressure on the companies to get rid of the good drugs, and so you get what you get. And so I very explicitly say, let's take a look. Let's see what actually happened here. And so I systematically dismantle this all abolitionists' fault mantra that, Justice Alito, the guerrilla war against the death penalty and all of that. It's just, it's a tagline and it's not true. So I talk about that, but, we could talk about how the drug shortage started, but the bottom line, which is in Europe, but the bottom line is these drug companies, they all have these, corporate core values and corporate, their own taglines. And I talk about all of those and say, one is like, life is our life's work. And so that's potentially awkward to use life is our life's work drugs to cause somebody to promptly die. And it's not, and so one might say, well, I'm a cynic. I don't think they mean it. They're all about the money. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but I'll tell you, they have a huge financial stake in not having states use their drugs for killing. They've been sued for botched executions. Milan had millions of dollars divested from them because their investors cared about not having drugs being used for executions. It's terribly bad for business. And so what they have done is they've put contractual provisions, end user agreements, on their sales, saying, we'll sell to you only if you sign a contract saying you're not going to use it for lethal injection and you're not going to sell to anybody who will. And what states have done in response is
This is the crazy town part.
It is all crazy town, but what they've done in response is they've made straw purchases. And so one example is an email that I quote from Ohio. It's from the Ohio Department of Corrections to the Ohio Department of, I think it's Health and Human Services, where they say in the email, look, when you order the drugs, do not tell them it's coming to us, and do not tell them what it's used for, because they have a contractual provision that says we can't use it for that and we don't want to, and they go on to say, don't tell them that or they won't sell to us. So they know, and these are, I think, well, this is the free market. I thought everybody liked the free market. These are private companies. They can sell to who they want to, they cannot sell. That's the whole point. So if they put contractual provisions, they're entitled to do that. And so to have these states, purposefully breaking their private contracts is really crazy to me. And what has happened is the drug companies, they mean it. And so when they find out, they have sued the Department of Corrections. And they have won some of these. They actually lost in Nebraska because when they sued, Nebraska said, well, you don't know if it's your drugs or some other company's drugs. And the drug company said, we do know because we're the only company that sells it in this amount, and that's how much you have. And they said, well, you can't prove it, and there's a secrecy measure so that we don't have to tell you whether it was your drugs or not. And so they lost there, but they won in Nevada. The judge issued this long opinion saying the state willfully and fraudulently entered into this contract. In Nevada, the DOC, Department of Corrections, had the drugs sent to a location 200 miles away from the prison to further the ruse that it was not for executions. So there's all of these things. And then I think of taxpayer money. Mm-hmm. And I just think, who's paying for all that litigation, don't you?
Well,
it's us.
I know they sell a lot of things at Walmart that are useful, but tell us about drug transactions in the Walmart parking lot.
Yes. So there's all of these other crazy things that happen. If you can't get the drugs from the drug companies, where can you get it? Well, maybe you can find a pharmaceutical company or a compounding company that will sell to you. And so one story that I tell in the book is Idaho. Idaho chartered a private plane and left and went to Washington State, to Spokane, with $15,000 in cash in a suitcase. And I was like, no, you didn't. You did not do that. Yes, they
Unmarked
did.
Bills.
Right. And they did this transaction. I'll tell you how they got outed, is that a law professor, Eliza Cover, asked for Freedom of Information Act information, and Idaho said, no, you're not entitled to it. And she said, oh, yes, I am. It's a transaction. I'm entitled to it. And they said no, so she sued. And that went through the courts for years. And she ended up winning that suit. And in fact, there were damages awarded to her. So taxpayers are paying for that too. And so she gets this treasure trove of data. And what's in it are all of these transactions. And one of those records said, they chartered a private plane, they went to Spokane, and they did the deed, they did this transaction in a Walmart parking lot. And the state came out and said, it was not in a Walmart parking lot. That's what you have to say? That's the problem, is that it wasn't in a Walmart parking lot. And, I looked at, because the logs to the plane, when they landed, that's all public too. So I looked, and I can't remember the exact times, but they landed at maybe 5:30, and the airport was more than 30 minutes away from the pharmaceutical. So they were clearly closed. So I'm like, I don't know where you did it, but there is a Walmart parking lot a block away. So who knows really what happened there, but this is the sort of thing. I'm like, $15,000 in cash. And there were some other transactions too. That's like $10,000 in cash that the states are doing. They falsified prescriptions. Got Texas doing that.
Am I correct that states have obtained lethal injection drugs from apartment buildings in India and from driving schools in England?
Yeah. So, I mean, these are just the stories. Thank you for reading. Clearly he knows the stories. But yeah, so, one of these, the main drug, sodium thiopental, had one domestic producer. And so I'm just going to talk about that a little bit too. But sodium thiopental was the first drug. It's a barbiturate, and it's an antiquated drug. It was being replaced by propofol. So as that happens over time, the drug companies stop making sodium thiopental, put their money into propofol. And so it just happened to be that by 2010, there's only one domestic producer of sodium thiopental, a company called Hospira. And so that's the first drug in the protocol. Now, they just weren't tracking their shipments, but anyway, that's what the DOCs were using. Well, Hospira gets an FDA inspection in 2009, and it's this old aged plant in North Carolina. We should be talking about North Carolina. And so they fail the FDA inspection. They have to do all of these repairs. And they decide, it's not worth it. We're just going to move our plant to where Big Pharma is generally, which is Europe. So they move their plant, Hospira moves their aging plant to Liscati, Italy, right outside of Milan. And they set everything up. They have to get the licensing. And the Italian government says to them, okay, but you're not selling to executioners, are you? And Hospira says, well, we really can't tell where our products go. And the Italian government says, well, then we're not going to license you. And also, you may be held responsible for what Americans call the death penalty, and we in Europe called state-sponsored murder. And so Hospira decides, it was 0.5% of what it was producing, and it's antiquated. So Hospira is like, we're just going to stop producing it altogether. And that is how the drug shortage starts. And so, where are you going to get the drugs? Well, it turns out litigation in Arizona, we learn they were getting it from London. But where in London were they getting it? They were getting it from a drug distributor that was actually a desk and 2 file cabinets in the back of a London driving school in this rundown area of town. So Great Britain is against the death penalty, so they shut that down.
It was called Dream Pharma.
It was called Dream Pharma.
What a nightmare.
That's good. I actually have a link in the back, in the end notes in the back, where I say, if you think like a picture speaks 1,000 words, so here's a picture of Dream Pharma, and it's literally this rundown. I think it's like Acme Driving School, and then in the little corner it says Dream Pharma. It's crazy. And then it's like, okay, well, Great Britain shut that down, and then Great Britain and Italy get together and say, we're totally against the death penalty. And yet, executioners are getting our drugs. So why don't we just put an export ban on all death penalty drugs? We're against the death penalty. Why are we supplying them? And so that's what they do. And so now we've really got a shortage. The next thing the states do that we find out is they went to this place called Harris Pharma in India. And Harris Pharma is just a guy named Chris Harris. And he used to work, he was good at selling. He used to work at the Dubai airport and got connected with one of the Indian drug manufacturers who, and they're like, he didn't work for us, he worked with us. So he told this company, I'm gonna take some supplies and use them as samples in third world countries. He takes them and sells them on the sly on the black market to Nebraska, gets caught at that. Finally, there's some investigative journalists, they're like, let's go check out Harris Pharma. Like, what is Harris Pharma? And they show up and they find it's just a little office building on the, 50th or 60th floor. It's got some laminate that says Harris Pharma. There's nobody in there. There's no manufacturing equipment, like there's nothing. And then that was the FDA address that they used. And then the DEA address, they were like, okay, well, there's this flat. They go to the flat and the landlord says, oh yeah, he used to live here, but he left without paying for 6 months rent. His cell phone is dead. Like, I can't get him. I've just decided to eat the rent. That's Harris Pharma. He was selling other people's drugs as his own. I mean, and the states know it. The states knew it. And they're like, yeah, that's all right.
You wouldn't make these stories up because the truth is actually more outlandish than anything we could imagine.
Yeah.
So I was told that we may want to leave some time for questions, Corinna, but I don't know if we're at that moment, or I have a lot more questions I could ask.
I don't know. Should we start
the
conversation? Yeah.
Why are we so proficient at euthanasia for animals, and maybe even people as well, not so much in the US, but it may be more in Europe, but we can't get it right for the death penalty, and lethal injection? Like, it just blew my mind. I've been there putting animals, to sleep, and and now I just question the whole thing. but like, what is the difference in the recipes? I guess is the prescriptions.
Yeah, and you said you had listened to the audio version.
I listened to the audio version. Yeah.
So that's like page 3 of my book. This was the research question.
Yeah.
And so I so appreciate it, which was
blown away by it.
Right, which is like, well, why are they so bad at this? I mean, the death penalty on the merits is its own thing.
Right.
But why also are we torturing people? And especially when we know how to put pets down and we know how physician-assisted suicide works, and we have operations, surgeries every day where we put people under and we cut their chest open, we do all these things. That was my question is, why are states so bad? And the answer took an entire book.
Right.
So part of it is the drugs. They weren't using the same drugs for the first 40 years of lethal injection. That 3-drug protocol that I told you about, not a single one of those drugs is what we use for animal euthanasia, And so there's a place in the book where I say, either that guy, Jay Chapman, either he didn't ask, gee, how do we put down pets? Like if somebody asked me how to do a humane death with drugs, that would be the first thing I would ask. I would say, well, I wonder, like, what do we do for pets? So either he didn't ask that question, which is hard to imagine, or he asked or he already knew, and he chose not to do that.
And we continue to choose not to do that,
and
right?
We continue to choose not to do
there's
that.
Constraints, like you said, the Hippocratic Oath, and then also the drug companies. But when are we going to step back and reassess?
Well, so I mean, some states have moved now to the 1-drug protocol, but they only moved to there was litigation over this. In fact, one of the stories I tell here is about litigation in Tennessee. And in Tennessee, the prisoners sued under the Non-Farm Animal Humane Death Act. And they said, we're animals, and we're not farm animals. So we're entitled to be put down under that act. That's the Cat and Dog Act, is what that is. That's your Pets Act. And they said, you know, we're suing under this act. Please treat us like pets, because it's so much better than what we get. And, you know, the judge, to his credit, said, well, legislative history, this wasn't meant for you. But as I say in the book, you know, the fact that they're suing, asking to be treated like animals is a huge statement of its own, especially for people that ostensibly have constitutional rights that keep the state from executing people however it wants, right? So some states have done it, have now moved to the pentobarbital, but for years of that litigation, the state said, oh, we could never do that. It would never work. And I quote them extensively. It'll take 45 minutes. They'll be shaken. We need that paralytic because otherwise there'll be all these shivers. None of that was true. None of it. And
trust us, we're the government.
yeah. And so that's part of the storytelling is like, here's what they said. I'm going to document it. You know, 99.99999% of the population will be unconscious and unfeeling in 60 seconds. None of that was true, you know? And so, you know, but even states, so two things. One, states that use a paralytic, they prefer the paralytic. And the Supreme Court lets them. It's the get out of jail free card. But number two, even states that use, you know, the one drug protocol, because of the drug companies, they're not actually using the same. They're using a compounded version, right? And it's not veterinarians, it's not trained professionals who are doing it. That was a surprise to me. I thought it was doctors doing it. It's not. The people pushing the syringes are non-medical prison guards. That's who's pushing the syringes in these cases. And you know, are you a veterinarian?
No.
But you know, it's like we actually had to put our sweet Zoe down this spring. She was 16, and the veterinarian came, and I was very good. I did not speak about my book. But you know, I'm watching her and thinking like, you know, professionals
yes.
do this. And if you had an anesthesiologist, and if you had the right drugs, and if you did it as a medical procedure, but we don't, none of those things are true, and they're not gonna be true, you know? So I think that's all of that is part of the reason. I don't know, what do you?
Oh, go ahead.
More?
Sure,
Yeah.
No, I mean, so one of the powerful parts, I think, of your message is the way it makes us focus on what in court they refer to as dignity, what I almost think of as aesthetics.
Oh,
Right.
totally.
So, like, you made the point that, well, some things would take too long. Well, why does it have to be so quick and final? It might be because if you let people die over a long period of time, it reminds us of how people die. It reminds us that it's a person. Or the other thing, the aesthetic point or the dignity point makes me think about is there are ways of instantaneously killing somebody, but you destroy their body. Like you could put somebody on a stack of dynamite in a field and set it off, and that would be quick, right? Painless, probably. But that would upset us because it would be on an aesthetic level. Because, well, you don't want to pull apart a body. Well, why not? Well, because that's a person. Right, and I think that your point about dignity is so well taken. I think it really reveals us to be deeply hypocritical about what we're doing.
Yeah, you put that so well. Thank you, Joe. And I will say my research question changed. It started as why are states so bad at this? And at some point along the years, it changed to why are states sticking with lethal injection?
Yeah.
Like, why? They can't get the medical professionals. They can't get the drugs. They can't get access to the veins. These people have notoriously bad veins. It's a terrible idea. It costs $1 gazillion, you know. Arizona spent $1.5 million on drugs for 3 executions and botched all 3. They're violating state and federal laws. They're falsifying prescriptions. You know, like all of it is not even humane. And so what is it that they're sticking with this thing like glue? I mean, a couple states are moving on, but this stuff has been going on for well over 15 years since it blew up, you know, since the drug supplier stuff. And the other problems have been there all along. So what is it about lethal injection? And I think the answer is exactly what you just said. You know, I think the answer is with lethal injection, we don't have to see the sight of blood that we do with the firing squad. We don't have to smell the sickly smell of burning flesh. That's the electric chair. We don't have to see gasping and retching and shaking on the gurney. That's the gas mask. We get to tell ourselves that these people are just drifting off to forever sleep. And that makes it really easy to not think about what this, you know, what the death penalty actually is. And I think when we talk about the death penalty in this country, we talk about it as an idea. Yeah. You know, it's like, are you for it or against it? Often on tribal lines, it's the death penalty in the abstract, and lethal injection is doing tremendous work in keeping the death penalty abstract. And so part of my project is, you know, we are killing human beings. And if you don't, I mean, I said this to somebody, they're like, oh, firing squad, it's so gross. I can't believe that. And I said, if you don't like the state shedding blood in your name, I got news for you. Like, that's what the death penalty is. If you don't like that, if you're like, yeah, it is, it's gross and it's violent, but that is what it is.
In a similar vein, I do mostly international-based research, and what I have enjoyed researching a lot is cultural attitudes towards criminals and criminality, and cultural attitudes towards death, dying, and grieving loved ones. And I'm fascinated to actually get to read your book for the first time. I apologize, I haven't read it in advance. But I'm curious how much you know about execution or death penalty processes in other countries, and if you have noticed a cultural linkage to that. I think a lot about how we view dignity and the facade of making it peaceful, and this idea that we are like a civilized country that won't hang our criminals, when in reality our alternative seems to be much more uncivilized, arguably. So I was wondering if you had known anything about other parts of the world in this regard.
Yeah, I actually taught an international perspectives on the death penalty in Cambridge, England this summer. And so one of the things that we studied was, okay, let's look at these different areas of the world. Let's look at what their policies are, and let's look at how they execute. And it's changed this year. For 2024, the stats are a little different because Iran and Iraq are going really gangbusters. But in 2023, the United States was one of the top 5 executioners in the world. And I have it down. I probably need to find it. But the others are like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, you know, Iran, Iraq, China. And if you wonder how are they executing, a few nation states like China has moved towards lethal injection because of us, but they also have the traditional way that they've been doing it for decades, which is just shoot someone in the back of the head. And you know, most of these other countries, it's I mean, these where in some you still have stoning, you have hanging, you have shooting. Lethal injection is this Western, clean, civilized,
and it's hidden too.
But it's not. Yeah.
Can I get you so with this?
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, here was 2023. China had over 1,000. executions. Iran, 853 in 1 year. Saudi Arabia, 172. Somalia, 38. And then the United States, 24. But it's like us and China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Somalia. That's really interesting company that we keep on this issue.
And we're trying to catch up. We have 30 so far this year in the United States.
Yeah, this year's a
bad year.
This year's a bad year. Although I have to say, looking at executions, that is a snapshot in time. That tells you we're in a very punitive moment. We're in a very cruel, full of brutality moment. But I'm not sure that it says much about the future of the death penalty, because last I looked, and you're probably tracking these numbers, is it 10 or 11 death sentences now?
New
in
death
the
sentences?
Country? Yeah.
I don't know.
This year.
New death sentences are still low.
Yeah.
And the 30 is a little bit of a anomaly because it's driven by Florida.
Exactly.
And Florida is being driven by Trump. And other states could also be driven by Trump, and maybe they are, but Florida's really the only one who's doing it.
Florida's had 11 already this year. The next most executing state is 4. So Florida's executed almost 3 times as much as any other state. But when you think of when I think of the future of the death penalty, I look at death sentencing, because today's death sentences are tomorrow's executions. If you don't have death sentences feeding the machinery of death, the death penalty is going to die on the vine. I mean, and if there's any doubt about that, that's Virginia's story. That's our story. We abolished the death penalty in 2021. We had not had a new death sentence in 10 years. We had 2 people left on death row. At that point, you're just paying for it. Death penalty's already dead. Why not get rid of it? So, and death sentencing is down, 80, I remember looking at 2024, and maybe it was 25 new death sentences.
It's been very low, and that has been my narrative, the Virginia narrative, throughout my career doing this since 2006. We are in a dangerous time to be vigilant, though, because Trump is unique, our dictator, in inspiring bad policy and horrible policy, and he wants to reinvigorate the death penalty, and he's trying to do it in Washington, D.C., and he's saying we should have the automatic death penalty, which the United States Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional, 5 decades ago. So we have to remain vigilant and get through this period to maintain these gains.
Yeah. I know you had a question or comment.
Yeah, I know we already talked a little bit about the emotional effects of watching a lethal injection, but did the state give reasoning for why it was like in the state's interest to make it look painless?
I mean, it's a great question, and that was its reason. Was they said, and the quote is, dignified for the inmate and dignified for the witnesses. And I think it was Justice Breyer who said, dignified for the inmate? And he was like, yes, sir, dignified for the inmate, which I talk about here and say, well, first of all, the inmates are the ones suing to stop using this. So I think they care more about a non-torturous death than a dignified death, and maintaining their dignity. I mean, they're not exactly around after the fact. So, I mean, that was just so spurious, of course. And so what I say in the book is, when you say dignified, what you really mean is dignified for the executing state. That's what we're really talking about here. And I mean, that is part of the project of the book, is I think the states have gotten the bump, right? They've gotten the legitimacy of what it looks like. I had a judge write to me last week. He said, I read your book. He said, I didn't buy it. I borrowed it from one of your former students, who is now my law clerk, which is fine. But he said, sorry, I didn't buy it. But he said, I really learned a lot. And he said, I always assumed that lethal injection litigation was the Hail Mary, meritless, just trying to stay alive, die another day, litigate to live. And he said, it turns out I was as uninformed as your person on the street. And that really meant a lot to me, because I thought, that's what I want to change. And my own view, I'd be interested in yours, is that litigation, I've been looking at this stuff and tracking it for years across the country and saying, why aren't they winning these? Why are they not winning these cases? And, I think some of that has to do with the Supreme Court, but I think until there's widespread distrust, until the gig is up, and then courts start saying, oh, maybe there are actual claims here, I don't see how that litigation goes very far. And so, part of my hope is that people do start talking about this, and that it infiltrates in the way that we know larger social movements and larger, currents do infiltrate into the judges, just because they live in society. I don't know.
I think in terms of the litigation, when this first started, we thought it seemed to be a loser as well, but sometimes you win by losing. And a lot of the stories in your book are brought out by researchers and investigators, but a lot of the stories in your book are brought out by litigation.
Absolutely.
And that's how we win, by exposing the flaws with the death penalty, by exposing that this is a facade of dignity, that it's really just a lie. And that's why North Carolina hasn't had an execution since 2006. And it's why executions really are down, but for this Florida blip, we are showing what's wrong with the death penalty through this litigation, even though we can't get the courts to rule it's unconstitutional. And as to your question, I completely agree that it's about the aesthetics. That's why they want this. And it reminds me of something that Justice Scalia said, and he was this conservative justice on the Supreme Court who favored the death penalty. And he thought he needed to answer another justice who famously said in a dissent in a death penalty case called Callins versus Collins, that I shall no longer tinker with the machinery of death. And that was, many Supreme Court justices have over time of looking at these cases have decided there's no constitutional way to impose the death penalty. And that's what, was it Blackmun who's saying?
It was Blackmun.
Yeah, it was Blackmun. So Scalia wants to respond, and he says, how I can't remember how envious it would be to be executed by being put to sleep for some of these folks, and he starts mentioning some of the folks that he thinks, are in such a great position to be executed in this manner. And it shows the other lies about the death penalty, because one of the people he mentions is a man named Henry McCollum, who Scalia said his case was before the court right now, and he is guilty, Scalia said, of killing and sexually assaulting a little girl in North Carolina. Henry McCollum was innocent, and his brother, who was a co-defendant, was innocent, and proven innocent in the state of North Carolina, and pardoned by our last Republican governor, McCrory, a pardon of innocence. And Scalia was saying, we've got this, very humane death penalty, and how envious it would be to go down like that for a guilty murderer like this. So the two lies are kind of brought together. It's not an envious death, it's a torturous death, and a lot of the people that they're subjecting to this death are innocent. And thank goodness that lawyers and other advocates in North Carolina kept standing up for Henry McCollum, and he's free today, and didn't get this kind of envious death.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the lawyers and the litigators, because
I'm not meaning to toot my own horn, but other people than me.
No, and I don't take it as that, but it's just when you think about these cases, McCollum, and I just think, wow, if it weren't for the lawyers, that are just litigating this stuff to the hilt, the time with time, all of these things come out. And so your work is just so incredibly important. And I am so fortunate, actually, to have this first bookstore event on this tour, to be with you, So I'm glad you live in Durham, I'm glad you can.
Oh, I will definitely toot the horn of the North Carolina Capital Defense Bar and the activists here. I mean, this is actually why the ACLU came to North Carolina. I work for a national project, so we work all over the country, and our original director said, we're not going to be in New York, where the mothership of the ACLU is. They don't have the death penalty. Where are we going to be? And we decided to come to North Carolina because there were so many good people fighting the death penalty here. So shout out to my North Carolina colleagues.
I think that's a really good place to end. We're a few minutes
Yeah.
over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
And so it shall be. Thank you.
Anyone who still has questions, feel free to ask them.
In a little box.
That's great.
Probably in your little box.
Yeah, that was funny that we didn't even.
We didn't talk about this at all, but
Just go for
it was
it.
great. No, it was so good.
Just wait for
You
it.
ready?
Take your time.
No,
Okay.
I'm gonna. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice meeting you.
Oh, no, that just.
Thanks for your work. Yeah.
Oh, my God, it's just-
Yeah.
Sorry, Cody, I didn't even notice we went over it because I was so
Thank
like
you.
in it.
Yeah. I hope you
I can
caught
do that.
some of that.
Okay.
Were you able to catch some of that?
I caught a good bit. I read
Okay.
some too.
Okay.
Some good stories, I think, but thank
Well,
you. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah.
no,